Great. Well, it is a pleasure to have the opportunity to speak today with Aaron Magid, who is the author of a new book on King Abdullah II of Jordan, the most American king. And we'll have the opportunity, if people have questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A, and we can either address them throughout or we'll save some time at the end for additional questions. But first of all, it is such a pleasure to have Aaron here with us to speak about his book, and I would love to have him go ahead and tell us, Aaron, about what is the overarching thesis of this book, kind of what is the message you hope people will take away from it?
Sure. So thank you very much for hosting me. The book's title is The Most American King Abdullah of Jordan. It really emphasizes King Abdullah's strong American ties. So first of all, he attended middle school and high school in Massachusetts at Deerfield Academy. He wrestled on the team. In fact, when his father wanted him to go for Arabic lessons, he would hide in the closet because he wanted to have more of an American upbringing. He used the name not Abdullah during that time. Afterwards, he attended Georgetown University, and he so much enjoyed the experience that he sent his own children to the prestigious DC University. He also trained with the U.S. military in Kentucky. He appeared on a Star Trek episode. And after spending so much time in the United States, by the time he became king in 1999, he actually spoke better English than Arabic. Right now, in fact, he's not in Amman or Erbil, he's in Idaho. In what people call the summer camp for billionaires, meeting with financial and media elite in the West Coast. So he has a very strong personal ties to the country, in addition to having luxurious properties both in the Washington, D.C. area and in California. But it's not just his personal ties to the United States are very strong, and it's also political. So King Abdullah was the first Arab leader to meet with President Trump in the White House, President Obama, and President Biden, showing the strong bipartisan ties with the United States. There are thousands of U.S. troops in Jordan, both under Democratic and Republican administrations. There's very close CIA ties with Jordan's intelligence services. And in fact, under King Abdullah, Jordan was the first Arab country to have a free trade agreement with the United States. So one of the main themes of the book is the very strong U.S. relationship he has. The second theme is the fact that he's remained in power for so long. And you look at many of his neighbors, whether to Iraq, where Saddam Hussein has fallen, Syria to his north, President Assad was recently toppled, to the south, Egypt and Hosni Mubarak during the Arab Spring protests, and you go to Tunisia, Libya, Yemen. So many other Arab leaders have fallen, but he stayed in power for over a quarter century. And the book explores why. Now, one reason is definitely the advantage that King Abdullah has as king. You see in the Arab Spring, the countries that have fallen, many of them have been presidents, none have been kings. So he has an advantage for that. There's some sort of legitimacy in the Arab world that kings have that presidents don't. But I would say it's more than just him being a king, because if you look at some of the other monarchies, many of them have a lot of oil wealth that they're able to shower upon their citizens, making it easier for them to stay in charge. King of Jordan has very little oil, and the country is quite poor. The unemployment rate is over 20%. So King Abdullah doesn't have an excess of national cash to provide his citizens to support his rule. So why is it? The second reason would be the strong support he has from Jordan's security forces. If you look at key times that he could have faced unrest in the country, his security forces have consistently stood by him. So one example would be the Prince Hamza sedition affair in 2021, where the king's half-brother seemingly wanted to take control over the country. But in fact, the Jordan's army chief went to stop him and went into his home to tell him that he doesn't have support, and he didn't have a significant backing from the intelligence services, which would have also been necessary to take control over the country. Now, about 50 to 60 years ago, the most significant threat to Hashemite rule was Black September in the 1970 Civil War, where thousands of Jordanians were killed during that. And what happened during that war was you had individuals in the Jordan security forces went against the Jordanian regime and joined with the Palestinian militants. And one of the lessons from that King Abdullah has taken is the senior level members of Jordan's security forces are comprised of Jordanians of East Bank or tribal background, not of Jordanians of Palestinian descent, to avoid that kind of skirmish. And in fact, since the Gaza war erupted from 2023 to the present day, there have been a lot of protests, and over 1,000 individuals have been detained. And the Jordanian security forces, despite many people in Jordan having sympathies for the Gaza cause and the Palestinian people, they have not turned away from the king, and they've continued to suppress these protests. So the strong Jordanian security forces role has been critical, and in contrast with Syria or Egypt, where you saw in Syria, for example, there were parts of the country that weren't under the control of the security forces, and that helped topple Assad last year. In Jordan, that doesn't exist. Same with Egypt and the Sinai, where there is some sort of, has been at least, autonomous areas where the security forces are in control. In Jordan, that doesn't exist, and that's ensured that his his regime has stayed in control for so long. So that's number two. Of course, the US alliance has been critical for his continuing power, and you see that with the nearly $1.5 billion in annual aid, the very strong military support for the Jordanian military, along with the assistance for the Jordan's intelligence services. So that's number three. And then I would argue that he also has a relatively nuanced approach towards dissent. Now, Jordan is certainly not a democracy. The Economist recently ranked Jordan as authoritarian, its lowest out of 4 rankings in its democracy index. It shows that the king is the one in control, parliament is toothless. However, at the same time, Jordan doesn't use, under King Abdullah, overwhelming force. He's not bombing his people like you see in Syria. He's not using chemical weapons on his people like in Iraq under Saddam Hussein. So it reduces the amount of discontent towards his regime because he's the one in control, but he's not using unnecessary levels of violence. So that's the second theme about his continuation of power. And the third theme is his strong support for the United States has led to disagreements among many Jordanians. So you see that in the 2003 Iraq War, Jordan hosted US troops then and allowed overflight rights from Jordan into Iraq. And many Jordanians were opposed to that. They said, why are we supporting an attack on a fellow Arab neighbor when the war was so unpopular? You saw it in the mid-2010s, about 10 years ago, during the gas deal with Israel, the largest trade agreement between Jordan and Israel, the multi-billion-dollar accord, where it was wildly unpopular among Jordanians, even though it was pushed by the Obama administration at the time, because many Jordanians thought that as Israel was continuing to rule over the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza, why should we be having such a lucrative agreement with them? And the last example, and there are many others, would be in the late 2014 when Jordan joined the anti-ISIS campaign. At that time, it was unpopular. Once again, why are we joining in a war in another Arab state? There were protests about that, especially when a pilot was kidnapped at that time. So you see a consistent theme where King Abdullah often goes with the priorities of the United States government, especially in foreign policy, and that leads to rifts with the Jordanian public.
Well, thank you. That was very extensive. One thing I wanted to go back to, a question that came up. Someone asked if his mother was if his mother was American, but his mother was British. And so I know this came up on social media. People were wondering, well, how is he the most American king if he's half British? And one thing I learned from your book was part of the reason King Hussein sent Abdullah first to the UK and then later to the United States was due to the threat of possible violence from the Palestinian liberation movements, which I hadn't understood that was why he spent so much time outside of Jordan growing up, was due to these security concerns, which gets to points you were already making about this very contentious relationship between Jordan and Palestine. If you could talk a little bit more, in the opening anecdote, I'll let you describe it, but you use that to sort of highlight the depth of the U.S. relationship with Jordan, or the degree to which Abdullah prioritizes his relationship with the United States. And people may recall this instance of the Jordanian pilot who was captured when his plane went down over Syria and was burned alive in a cage by Daesh, which was shocking and horrifying in the US as well as obviously in Jordan. But if you could talk a little bit more about that and the way that, or why it was that you chose that anecdote to sort of highlight this.
Sure. So it was a very important moment in King Abdullah's reign. As you mentioned, it was absolutely horrifying for many Jordanians to see one of their pilots first being kidnapped by ISIS and then the Jordanian government being unable to bring him back. And then finally, he was burnt alive. I chose that specific event because, first of all, during this moment of national turmoil, instead of staying in Jordan and trying to deal with the crisis domestically, he flies to the United States to continue with his meetings. He goes to the United States so many times. So he did not stop engaging with the United States even during that moment. Number two is during even after he was killed, he still continued with some of the meetings because he felt that the U.S. relationship was that important. And then number three, during that time, there were a lot of protests inside Jordan saying that we should not be involved in that war, especially when one of our own is being kidnapped. And they were saying that the king was being kind of bribed by American dollars for that affair. There was a lot of tension in the country. There were Muslim Brotherhood members of parliament who opposed the operation. So people were just saying that why is the king prioritizing the anti-ISIS affair when before Jordan was involved, there was they thought that there was no connection between Jordan and that war. For the United States, it was very important for Jordan to participate in that campaign because they wanted to change the narrative, especially after the 2003 war in Iraq, where the U.S. was viewed as kind of crusaders, but they said it with the 2014 war that, hey, we have other Arab countries with us, like Jordan, flying against ISIS. And then also what I found very interesting was that the king, when he was demonstrating his need for revenge, he cited, an American movie to illustrate the need for a very tough response. And his knowledge of American culture and American TV sitcoms and movies is just phenomenal for an Arab leader. To be honest, I'm an American citizen, but he seems to know more about American culture than I do. And it's a way that he was able to bond with whether U.S. lawmakers, American media, or the White House that gives him advantage because he spent so much time in the United States in addition to his fluent English.
And it's interesting because you describe him as spontaneously quoting this, I think, a Clint Eastwood film in terms of needing to take revenge for this horrific murder of this Jordanian pilot. But I was curious because to what extent do you think it is more calculated that he knows in front of Congress to use a reference to an American movie sort of highlights that, his ties to the United States? So I was curious about your characterization of this as kind of spontaneous versus calculated.
Sure. So it's a good question in the sense that I don't think he wasn't planning for weeks to use that reference because he didn't know that the pilot was going to be burnt alive. He just found that out when he was in Washington that day. And then I think he was quite angry. And that was one example that came up in his head. So I don't think he was planning for that incident for many weeks. But certainly I do agree with you that before he meets with members of Congress or the White House in general, he is thinking about ways to connect Jordan, which is a country thousands of miles away that many Americans, whether in Iowa or Nebraska, aren't thinking about on a regular basis. And he's trying to bridge that gap. So one way he does it is through the cultural connections.
Certainly, and makes sense given that he spent much of his formative years here in Deerfield, Massachusetts. There was a question in the Q&A about whether his father was more cautious about ties to the U.S. or is Abdullah's policy sort of extending a track his father was on already. And I mean, my assessment of that would be that, Abdullah has much more close personal ties to the United States that Hussein didn't. But whether you would see Abdullah's sort of very close partnership with the U.S. perhaps as something Hussein would have done, or would Hussein have chosen a different approach?
Sure, it's a great question. So first of all, as you mentioned, the personal ties that King Abdullah has are far stronger than King Hussein. So King Hussein actually became king when he was a teenager, unlike King Abdullah, who became king in his 30s. And he did not spend very much time in the United States before he was king. It's very different than King Abdullah, who spent, middle school, high school, parts of university, training in the military. I mean, you can go on and on. His honeymoon was in Hawaii and New York. So there are just so many examples so King Hussein did not have that. But I think it goes beyond the personal to the political. And one key example would be how they contrasted with the handling of the Iraq wars during their reign. So in the first Gulf War, King Hussein strongly opposed the U.S. invasion of Iraq to defend Kuwait, and he said that this is immoral, and we cannot support this, an attack on a fellow Arab neighbor who was extremely close to Saddam Hussein at the time. And that strong opposition towards the U.S. invasion of Iraq actually caused Jordan to significantly reduce its assistance from the United States. And it led to a chill in relationship between the two countries that only became better in 1994 when President Clinton helped mediate the peace treaty with Israel. So that was King Hussein's approach to the Iraq War. And King Abdullah, he certainly did not support the Iraq War. He also thought it was a mistake. And in some of his predictions actually turned out to be correct about the problems with the military and the Sunni Shia conflict. So he predicted that correctly, but he was not strongly opposing the U.S. war publicly. And then he also allowed U.S. troops to be present. He allowed the U.S. troops to flyover rights into the country, intelligence gathering missions. And Jordan actually played a key role in training Iraqi security forces after the invasion started in order to support the new administration. So they took a very different approach towards the Iraq war. And what Jordan did under King Abdullah was ensure that not only aid did not decrease like what happened to King Hussein, but actually increase because of the productive role and what the Bush administration at the time viewed of his role in the Iraq war. There was also tensions King Hussein had with President Carter at the time over the peace treaty with Egypt, and that led to tensions and also a reduction of aid. So you see that King Hussein in general had strong ties to the United States, but he was willing to, if he felt that something was against national or pan-Arab interests, he would be willing to go against it. King Abdullah, even when there is criticism of the United States, and I'll take in 2017, 2018, during the first Trump administration is a great example. King Abdullah opposed the transfer of the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. He opposed the cutting of aid to the Palestinian Authority, but he handled it very different than Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas, who called President Trump, a dog. Very strong criticism of the president. King Abdullah focused on the policy differences and just said, we don't support it. But at the same time, we need to preserve a strong political ties with the United States. And that also led during the first Trump administration to an increase of U.S. aid to Jordan. So I do think there was a substantial difference between King Hussein and King Abdullah and how they handled U.S. ties.
Certainly. And I think it would be useful to go into that a little bit more. So not only to get into, as you were saying, kind of the ups and downs of the relationship with Trump, but to back up a little bit to a little bit more. So not only the fact that Abdullah was involved in directly supporting the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, but then beyond that, including under Obama. And you ask in the book sort of why is it that, Clinton, Bush to a certain extent, but the United States has prioritized relations with this small, impoverished, a country that otherwise does not seem to have a lot of strategic importance. So talking about that, and then also kind of the ways in which, perhaps in more recent history, the U.S. hasn't necessarily prioritized the relationship with Jordan as much.
Sure. So going back to the beginning of the relationship under King Abdullah's time in 1999, he met with President Clinton shortly after King Hussein passed. President Clinton actually flew into Amman for King Hussein's funeral to show how important both the U.S.-Jordan relationship was, but also how he wanted to make sure King Abdullah would succeed in meeting with him shortly and then supporting him afterwards. So when President Bush came into power shortly afterwards, Jordan signed the first free trade agreement with the United States, the first one for an Arab country, and that was a big success for King Abdullah. And then after 9/11, one of the reasons that Jordan was so important for the United States was its very strong support for the U.S. anti-terrorism campaign. They helped in Afghanistan. There were actually terrorist suspects that the U.S. eventually sent to Guantanamo Bay, but before they sent them to Guantanamo Bay, they sent them to Jordan first, under King Abdullah's, of course, agreement, because Jordan security forces and intelligence could interrogate they were non-Jordanian individuals, but they could interrogate them freely, or I'm assuming with a lot of violence, in ways that U.S. Security forces couldn't do. And then from there, they sent them to Guantanamo Bay. So the very strong U.S. Jordanian counterterrorism efforts, together. And then during the Obama administration, once again, King Abdullah was the first Arab leader to meet with him in the White House in 2009. And then afterwards, you see a very different reaction to the Arab Spring protests, for example, between how the US under Obama handled it in Egypt versus in Jordan. So in Egypt, President Obama called on Hosni Mubarak to resign. He played a very strong role in ensuring that there would be a new administration because of the protests. And there were significant protests in Jordan as well, week after week on Friday, over economic discontent, over corruption, over the authoritarian practices under King Abdullah. And King Abdullah was certainly not leading a democratic state whatsoever. But President Obama refused to engage such pressure on King Abdullah like he did with Hosni Mubarak to resign. And it shows because of what the United States views as very strong national security interests that exist in Jordan under King Abdullah that were not felt the same way under Hosni Mubarak. And then even during the Trump administration, once again, King Abdullah is the first Arab leader to meet with him shortly after he becomes in power, always presenting the Jordanian narrative very quickly. And there were disagreements during the first administration over a lot of issues on the Palestinian cause, but they were able to separate those disagreements and ensure that the aid, which is obviously the most important concern for the Jordanian regime, given budgetary issues and all the economic woes that are experienced in the country, aid under King Abdullah, under President Trump increased. And there was a lot of attention earlier this year in 2025 over U.S. aid, a worldwide cut, a worldwide freeze, and that included Jordan, and many Jordanians were quite nervous about that. So what did King Abdullah do? He quickly meets with President Trump in February 2025. And after the meeting, even though there were disagreements over the transfer of Palestinian refugees to Jordan, that was a proposal of President Trump at the time, you see a glowing video that President Trump gives about King Abdullah, how he's such a great leader and Jordanians are lucky to have him, and how amazing he is. These are like literally his words. And then afterwards, quietly, you see Reuters report it, you see Amman-net report it, that the large security cooperation aid that goes from the United States to Jordan actually has been resumed, which is critical for the country. So time and time again, King Abdullah has leveraged his personal ties with the country, obviously is fluent English, to bolster his country's cause and to ensure the aid continues to flow, which is a national security priority for the Hashemite kingdom.
Certainly. You've touched on so much, and there's so much, so many questions I have. But I'm going to answer or have you speak to one of the questions that came up, which was, to what extent do you think Abdullah, behind closed doors, tells the Americans and Israelis, help keep me on the throne because my half Palestinian and half Jordanian son offers a possible future route to resolve the Israel-Palestine conflict? Obviously, or maybe not obviously, his wife, Queen Rania, is Palestinian, or is perceived, as being Palestinian, but although she was born in Jordan?
In Kuwait.
Kuwait. Okay, but that his son Hussein, who is the crown prince and ostensibly will succeed him, that theoretically this is a means of resolving the Israel-Palestine conflict. I'm curious about the extent you think that sort of an argument would hold water with U.S. administrations, especially this one. Or instead, as we seem to be seeing at the moment, Trump does seem to be on board with the idea of just simply ethnically cleansing Gaza, as well as possibly the West Bank, which Jordan has been very clear would be an existential threat if Israel were to push millions of Palestinians over the border into Jordan.
Sure, so that's a long question. Some of it seems to be comments rather than questions, so I'll try to answer. First of all, I do think behind closed doors, he's strongly supporting an end to the Gaza war. He has actually been calling for the war to end for well over a year. It's not in Jordan's national interest for the war to continue. Number one, just because of the strong familial ties that exist for many Jordanians who are of Palestinian descent, roughly 50% of them. So many of them have relatives in the West Bank and Gaza, and the high death toll is very difficult for them. So that's number one. Number two, is there have been a lot of protests in the country about Jordan's stance towards the war. Jordan, of course, has kept its peace treaty with Israel since 1994, even though there are calls by many Jordanians to cancel it. The gas deal has not been annulled, and many Jordanian citizens are opposed to that as well. So the longer the war goes on, the more protests there are. And then you've seen recently with the Muslim Brotherhood since April, you've had accusations by the Jordanian government of them engaging in violence, targeting both Jordanian security forces, allegedly, or also smuggling weapons for Palestinian militants in the West Bank. So the longer the war goes on, the more discontent there is from the public, both towards Israel, but also towards the Jordanian government. So Jordan is certainly interested in the war ending, and they're using leverage, both King Abdullah privately and publicly, for that. At the same time, the leverage is pretty minimal. The Netanyahu government is certainly not deciding its Gaza policy based on what King Abdullah says. So that has to be acknowledged as well. I don't think that King Abdullah is saying to President Trump, because my son is half Palestinian, therefore that might solve the conflict, and therefore we should try to end the war. Crown Prince Hussein is meeting with many leaders, but I wouldn't overemphasize the Crown Prince's current role in trying to resolve the Israeli-Gaza war.
Certainly. And there was another question about Abdullah's legitimacy, which I think is a much bigger, I would be curious in having you speak to that question more broadly, in particular, an issue that I've long been interested in, the way that Abdullah, as well as other Arab leaders, try to use religious legitimacy. So in Abdullah's case, as a Hashemite, a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, using that sort of as a form of legitimacy. And you spoke earlier about the ways it seemed that kings had more legitimacy in the context of the Arab Spring. I think part of that may have been the fact that when you saw a monarch about to fall in Bahrain, for example, you saw the Saudis send in troops to make sure that wouldn't happen. So it may have been just the kings were watching out for each other. And I do think there was additional injections of resources from the Gulf countries to Jordan to help to preserve this sort of image that presidents may fall, but kings do not fall. But so you also, it was interesting, some of the fantastic research you did for this book, and some of the anecdotes. I mean, things like people who knew Abdullah as a young man, that he liked to drink, that he did not appear to be a practicing Muslim in any other way. And yet then, especially after 9/11, really does try to take on this mantle of so-called moderate Islam and portraying Jordan and his pedigree as a Hashemite as contributing to his leadership in the Arab world, of sort of delegitimize instances of terrorist violence carried out by those claiming to act in the name of Islam. So I would just be curious to hear your thoughts on the way Abdullah has tried to use religion, but then in my reading has seemed to have backed off from that to a certain extent. And this may reflect the fact that wealthier countries like the UAE and Saudi Arabia have been really trying to edge in on that promoters of moderate Islam label.
Sure. So a
there's
lot of great points there. So yes, as you mentioned, King Abdullah discusses how he is a personal descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, and that, from his argument, tries to bolster his religious legitimacy in the country. Another example would be his connections to Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem, and he says there's a special Jordanian ties to that to ensure Muslim worship in the city. And he uses that argument as well to try to strengthen his legitimacy in the country. Now, specifically, what you cited in terms of his attempt to delegitimize terrorism in the country while using religious justification for that was the Amman message in the mid-2000s that King Abdullah heavily pushed at the time. That was a big priority, especially when you were seeing a lot of suicide bombings in Iraq. Including Jordanians who were carrying them out, with Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, who's of Jordanian background. It was an attempt by King Abdullah to say that you can be a religious Muslim and you can be a strong opponent of this violence of terrorism. And he pushed that. He had a lot of both interfaith meetings in the country and as well within the Muslim community to try to push that message. Though you saw some difficulties with that message in the mid-2010s, where many Jordanians were leaving the country to fight in Syria and Iraq with ISIS and other Sunni extremist organizations like Al-Qaeda. Jordan actually had one of the highest percentage of foreigners who were participating in this act of terrorism. So clearly there were many Jordanians who, while they weren't carrying out terrorism inside the country, they weren't targeting Jordanian security forces to a high degree like you saw in Syria, Iraq, Egypt, or elsewhere in the Arab world. They were not so pleased with the Jordanian religious messages because then they went out to fight with ISIS. So that was a challenge for him. And it's correct, as you mentioned, not just about the drinking, that when I spoke with individuals who spent time with King Abdullah as a kid and more as a teenager and as an adult, but it's also, I spoke with someone who was in the US military training program with him in Kentucky when King Abdullah was there in his 20s, and he talked about him partying and going out with women at the time. So it's certainly not a message that would be consistent with kind of a hardcore interpretation of Islam that some might be pushing in the Arab world. And I think that does answer a little bit about your question before in terms of why King Abdullah hasn't continuously strongly pushing the religious message and strengthening his political legitimacy, because I don't think he views that as kind of most authentic to himself. And I don't think it convinces many Jordanians, because many Jordanians realize that the king is not, he's not an extremely observant Muslim in a traditional way. So he's not really pushing that message. And then I think it's just critical to emphasize, even though he has stayed in power for so long, it's not like the people are choosing him in elections every 4 years. This is not a democracy, it's an authoritarian regime, and it's very difficult to, even if you're unhappy with the king's policies, you're unhappy, which many of them are about the foreign policies, but probably most Jordanians are unhappy with economic issues. Just the unemployment is super high in Jordan, it's over 20%. And just for perspective, during the Great Depression in the United States, the unemployment rate was 25%. So we're at nearly Great Depression levels, and this is not like right now in 2025, this is a strange phenomenon. It's been going on for years that the unemployment rate has been over 20%, and these are official government figures. So you can imagine there's a lot of discontent with his policies, especially because when he came into power, one of his priorities was improving the economy, and it's just been a failure. So there's a lot of discontent, but it's very difficult to unseat a king when he has the security forces on his side, and the average citizen who's unemployed in Tafila or in Irbid or in Zarqa, they're just kind of by themselves.
Well, one follow on there. I mean, to what extent do you think the religious messaging was really more intended for an English-speaking audience versus an Arabic-speaking audience? I mean, my understanding is there's some aspect of emphasis on the idea of the Amman message, that to be a Muslim is you do not engage in takfir or accusing someone else of apostasy. But I think when the Amman message website first came out, it was only available in English. And that I think a lot of this, at least in my reading, was a lot more aimed at sort of portraying himself as this leader that needed to stay on his throne, and thereby the US and the rest of the world should try to keep him there. So to what extent do you think that Abdullah isn't even all that interested in his legitimacy in the eyes of his own people versus in the eyes of the Americans?
So I definitely agree with you that in the mid 2000s, under the Bush administration, the war on terrorism in Iraq, it was a strong priority for the king to show that he's a partner with the United States. He has the same views on Islam and views against terrorism, and the Amman message was certainly a big part of it, to show that I'm with you, I'm a strong ally, and therefore you should continue to send hundreds of millions of dollars at that time per year to my country to support my message, so we can keep an island of stability in the region under my control. So I definitely think that that's a key part. I do think he certainly wants to increase his political legitimacy at home. I do think he would like to improve the economy, for example, but it's just extremely difficult to do so, given the lack of oil and just the poor overall. There's very little high-tech sector in Jordan. The education levels in the public schools is considered quite poor. So he would like to improve the situation because that would be in his interest. He has no ideological reason to oppose a better economy. It's just been poorly implemented, and it's just been a huge challenge.
Certainly, certainly. I guess if you could speak a little bit more to some of Abdullah's promises early on to democratize many young kings, similarly, King Mohammed VI took the throne in Morocco in a sort of around the same time. Both of them, both Abdullah and Mohammed, replaced their fathers who had been on the throne for decades and decades. And both of them pledged to transition their countries to more of a constitutional monarchy. And over time, we've seen neither of them doing that. And even in the most recent parliamentary election, I saw some discussion of the fact that there was an effort to sort of prioritize political parties more, to enable the country to move towards a more robust, competitive process of elections, and that arguably Abdullah would then empower parliament. Um, but the result, the long-standing argument has been, at least from Arab leaders, has been, well, if we democratize, then the Islamists come to power. So I'm curious to hear your thoughts on whether there are other factors there in Abdullah's transition away from his earlier promises to democratize, and whether you think that is still a priority for him.
So great questions. Even from 1999, when he came into power, he gave an interview that year with ABC's Peter Jennings, and he said the sky's the limit in terms of democracy, clearly trying to appeal to, it was a Democrat in power, President Clinton at the time, to the United States with that comment. And then in the early 2000s, you had President Bush at the time pushing democracy across the Arab world after Iraq, and there were elections in Iraq, and there were Palestinian elections. So Jordan King Abdullah appointed former Foreign Minister Moan Muasher to push the national agenda. And once again, you have this flowery language of human rights, democracy, changing election law, having a move towards democracy. But then very little came out of that. There was a terrible terrorist attack in Amman, the hotel bombings. That killed 60 individuals, and that stalled any political reform efforts. Then you move on to the Arab Spring, when there were protests Friday after Friday, both in Amman and across the Hashemite kingdom, upset not only with the economy, but the lack of political reform. Now people realize that Jordan still remained an authoritarian regime. Once again, King Abdullah promises to enact political reforms. One of them is, instead of the king, he promised at the time in 2011, instead of the king appointing the prime minister, it would be selected by parliament. Of course, this was never implemented, and still to this day, the king is the one who chooses which prime minister is in power. And an interesting phenomenon in Jordan is often the prime ministers are chosen not after the elections, but they're chosen right before. So then one wonders, like, why are you going to elections if the prime minister is already, for the next term, is already chosen beforehand? So there were time and time again these political reform efforts that really went nowhere. There was another one after 2021, the Prince Hamza affair, where once again the king realized that there is significant discontent in the country with how the country is being ruled. And then they adopted a new political parties law to allow political parties have a better chance in elections, and presumably that would be a more democratic form. And then 2024, in the recent elections, the Islamic Action Front, the Muslim Brotherhood's political wing, did well by Jordanian standards. Now, they didn't win a majority. They won about 30-something seats, so they were 30 out of well over 100. So they were a significant minority, but it was still larger than in many previous races. And then what happens this year is there's a significant crackdown on the Muslim Brotherhood, where offices are being closed, funds are being seized, Muslim Brotherhood members are being arrested. So one wonders, what's the point of elections if your party can do really well, but then there's still significant crackdown measures on the Muslim Brotherhood at the same time. So it's really difficult to understand why the king continues to push all these political reform efforts when clearly the country is just as authoritarian, or maybe one could argue more authoritarian now than in 1999. But he does it time and time again. I don't think it's fooling many Jordanians. They realize the country is certainly not a democracy. Parliament is toothless, and the king is the one who's calling the shots on major security and national economic concerns. But time and time again, there is this political reform message. Maybe it's to appeal to the United States, but certainly right now in 2025, it seems unlikely that President Trump is desperately waiting for another Jordanian domestic political reform effort. And in fact, that could be one reason why you've seen less attention to that from the royal court in recent months since President Trump has returned to power.
Certainly, I would definitely agree with the idea that Jordan has grown more authoritarian. There have been ups and downs. Certainly, there were periods under Hussein's rule that were quite authoritarian. But I think the overall trajectory of Abdullah's rule has not been towards greater political representation or democratization, but unfortunately in the other direction. There are a few questions pertaining to the issue of Palestine, and I think useful to talk about. One was, how has Abdullah reacted to the increasing encroachment of the Haram al-Sharif in Jerusalem by far-right Israelis? After all, his authority over administrating the compound has been significantly undermined over the recent years, and just the context there is that Jordan does have the custodianship of Muslim and Christian holy sites in Jerusalem, left over from agreements made when under British rule, under the Mandate of Palestine. So that's a specific question about the Haram al-Sharif, but also perhaps opens up more questions having to do with the current situation and how that's impacting political dynamics in Jordan.
So it's been quite difficult for King Abdullah on the issue of the holy sites in Jerusalem since October 2023. Before October 23, I would argue he had more influence. At that time, you would have an Israeli minister visiting the compound, and then he would withdraw. He would reprimand the Israeli ambassador, or he would summon the Jordanian envoy in Tel Aviv back to Amman when there were perceived violations of the status quo in Al-Aqsa and in Jerusalem. What's happened right now because of the war, everything in Jerusalem is being overwhelmed by what's happening in Gaza. So there's little attention for whatever the Jordanian Foreign Ministry issues a statement about Al-Aqsa because everyone is so focused on Gaza. And you have, a lot of Israeli, whether visits from lawmakers or ministers or individuals themselves to the Temple Mount or Al-Aqsa. And from a Jordanian government perspective, it's very difficult to have a coherent message on the topic that's effective, considering that everyone is so focused on Gaza. So their influence has certainly declined on that issue, I would argue, since October 2023. And as well on the issue of the Gaza war writ large. So after the war started, Jordan did summon its ambassador who was stationed in Tel Aviv and brought it back to Amman, and there hasn't been a Jordanian ambassador in Israel since 2023. Also, it told the Israeli ambassador not to return to Amman, and there's no senior Israeli diplomatic delegation in Amman right now. There was a water for energy deal that was pushed by the United States and the United Arab Emirates with Jordan and Israel, and Foreign Minister Safadi did freeze that in November of 2023. Queen Rania made very strong remarks against the Gaza war and against Israel's policy during the first about year and 3 months. But it's interesting, you've actually seen the Jordanian government tone down its criticism of Israel since January of 2025 because it wants to balance its relationship with the Trump administration and it views that some of its comments have irritated Republicans on Capitol Hill. Jordan also did support the ICC case with South Africa, and Foreign Minister Safadi has accused Israel of committing genocide in Gaza. So there has been some strong criticism, but at the same time, Jordan always continues its delicate balancing act. On the one hand, public criticism, but on the other hand, Jordan has refused to cancel the peace treaty with Israel, refused to annul the gas deal. And then from Israel's perspective, most importantly, during the recent Iran-Israel war, Jordan is actually, under King Abdullah's decisions, has shot down Iranian missiles repeatedly fired at Israel and saved many Israeli lives. The Jordanian government argues, we're not doing it to save Israeli lives, we're doing it to protect Jordanian national sovereignty, but the net result is it is saving Israeli lives, and they're of course not shooting down Israeli fighter jets flying over Jordan. And there is some discontent among Jordanians for that. They're saying so many Palestinians are being killed, and yet we're saving Israeli lives. So it's a very difficult balancing act that he's doing. Part of the reason also he's doing it is to maintain very strong ties with the United States. It was a priority both during the Biden administration and in the Trump administration for those missiles to be shot down, and there are U.S. troops stationed in Jordan. And one of those reasons is for these kinds of actions. So it's a difficult balancing act. that he's dealing with. On the one hand, being opposing Israel's war, but on the other hand, trying to salvage his relationship with the United States and with the White House.
I'm curious to what extent you think, moving forward, well, as you've described, Abdullah, throughout his reign, his political calculus has seemed to prioritize the relationship with the United States and sometimes the preferences of the United States over the preferences of his own people. And he's been rewarded with significant assistance, security assistance, other assistance from the United States, partnership, and waxing and waning, but to a certain extent, a degree of influence inside the White House, depending on the president and the timing. To what extent do you think moving forward, Abdullah may need to shift his calculus? And this is a question kind of more broadly, going beyond kind of a President Trump and just sort of into the future. To what extent do you think the US will prioritize keeping a Hashemite, whether it's Abdullah or Hussein, on the throne? Um, versus to what extent do you think Abdullah is fully committed? And, as you pointed out, this is part of why we've seen the Jordanian government walk back some of its criticism of the United States since Trump took power. Um, and also, in addition to what do you think Abdullah's calculus is, do you think it's the right choice? Do you think that the US will continue to prioritize keeping a Hashemite on the throne by providing these kinds of financial and political assistance?
So great questions. As you mentioned, he has been rewarded pretty significantly for his support of U.S. policies, going back from the Clinton administration all the way to today with Trump. I do think that long term, King Abdullah is going to keep many of these policies. I think it's in his DNA. Just from a kid in the United States to training with the U.S. military in Kentucky, he has these very strong connections to the country that if the United States were to pull back its support, it would be very difficult for King Abdullah to find a replacement for Washington. So in February, when there was talk about the whole Gaza population transfer from Gaza to Jordan, and King Abdullah was opposed to that. Now, first of all, I want to emphasize that it's not like King Abdullah was unique in the Arab world in opposing that. Every single Arab country opposed that. Saudi Arabia, Egypt. So there were no supporters in the Arab world for that plan. So King Abdullah was quite consistent. But even if King Abdullah were to lose Washington support, which I don't think is going to happen, but who is going to replace it? It's not going to be Russia, which is bogged down in Ukraine. They're not going to be sending Jordan, billions of dollars in aid. That's just not their policy. There's a significant amount of tensions between Jordan and Iran. It's not just over the Iranian missiles. King Abdullah actually accused back in 2004 Iran of having like a Shia crescent across the Middle East. King Abdullah accused a Shia political party backed by the IRGC in 2004 for bombing a Jordanian embassy in Baghdad. So there's a lot of tensions between him and Iran. And also China. China has given loans to Jordan for various programs, but they always want the money back. And very few countries are at the level of the United States who are just going to give the aid unconditionally for free without payment in return. So I don't think under King Abdullah, we're likely to see a significant change away from the United States, even if there might be frustrations with this specific policy or another. First of all, as you mentioned, 2028, we could have a Democratic presidency, and then it's more of a traditional relationship with King Abdullah highly valued. The interesting question could be is what happens with his son? Because just as King Abdullah had certain changes from his father, whether it was a policy towards Iraq war, another major change was attitudes toward Hamas. And King Hussein, when he was in power, allowed senior Hamas officials to be present, stationed in Jordan, to have a relative amount of influence in the country. King Abdullah, one of the first things he did when he came into power in 1999 was he expelled the senior Hamas leaders, which was certainly supported by the United States at the time. So we could certainly expect to see under Crown Prince Hussein differences with the current king, whether one of those differences will be ties to the United States. We don't really have enough information about the Crown Prince. The royal court shields him from many interviews with the Western media. In fact, I don't think I've seen a single interview with the Western media. In general, the only press engagements he does is either with the state-aligned Jordanian press or pro-Jordanian institutions like like Al Arabiya, for example. So we don't really know what his thoughts are independently of kind of the royal court at this point, but it is conceivable that he would make a shift away from the United States. So at the same time, it's worth emphasizing that he also went to Georgetown University, speaks English fluently, and has very strong connections with the United States as well.
You anticipated my question. We had a few questions in the chat about Queen Rania, also a few about Queen Noor, although I think maybe those were mostly supposed to be about Rania. Crown Prince Hussein's mother, who is Palestinian, and you mentioned, for example, she had been more outspoken earlier on about condemning the horrific death toll in Gaza. You also get into other aspects of her efforts as queen, in particular, to prioritize women's rights, and then the ways that she was often thwarted in that. So I wanted to have you speak a little bit about that because there seemed to be some questions about her.
Sure. So Queen Rania played a very important role in King Abdullah's reign, especially in the first, I would say, 15 years. Lately, she's had a bit of a lower profile, especially on domestic political issues. She's been more outspoken on maybe Palestinian issues in English, but less in the Jordanian media on human rights concerns inside the country. But in the first few years, she was very outspoken, especially on women's rights. So one example would be if a Jordanian woman marries a foreigner and wants to pass down citizenship to their child, under Jordanian law, that's prohibited. So many people see that's a gender equality problem. And she tried to push to end that policy and allow women to be able to pass down their citizenship to their children. And she pushed it, and then there was a backlash among many East Bank Jordanians who said that this was going to turn the country into another Palestinian state. And they attacked her also because of her Palestinian lineage for that. So that was a challenge. She also tried to push for a law that allowed Jordanian women to divorce their husbands, which at the time was prohibited. And she faced resistance from some members of parliament for that. So she has faced some challenges, even though she's been outspoken on some of these gender equality issues. I would say the highest level criticism she faced was in 2011 during the beginning of the Arab Spring protests. There were some individuals who at that time were still reluctant to criticize the king personally. So what they did is they turned their ire against his wife. And there was a letter from over 35 senior Jordanian tribal members, and they attacked her for using her influence for her own personal gain and having a disproportionate amount of political involvement, which they said was inappropriate at the time. And then after that, in 2011, the royal court urged her to lower her media profile because they saw her as not connecting well with kind of the average Jordanian citizen who especially comes from a disadvantaged background. As you mentioned, in the late 2023, we saw after the Gaza war, she harshly condemned Israel for the attacks in Gaza, and she was interviewed on CNN. She had, I think, an op-ed in the Washington Post. So she had a strong platform there that resonated with many Jordanians for their criticism of Israel. But then once again, in recent months, she's toned it down pretty significantly, probably based on the suggestions of the king and the security forces to preserve the ties with the United States.
We're coming to the end, but we have yet to highlight the extensive interviews you did, including with some very high-profile figures, people like Ehud Olmert, Tony Blair. So I wanted to give you a couple moments to highlight whatever you wanted to, funny anecdotes of some of the really high-profile people you were able to access for this book.
Sure. So thank you very much for the question. I tried to get as wide-ranging of a view on the king as possible, given the limits of working with a country that's authoritarian. So I'll just be totally honest. I tried to interview the king multiple times with the royal court, but the royal court declined to put him available for an interview. Now that's not surprising. He did give a blockbuster interview in 2013 with The Atlantic magazine and Jeffrey Goldberg, where he criticized the Muslim Brotherhood, the tribes, various regional leaders. And since that interview, he's been much more cautious when he engages with the media. Now, he'll still talk about Al-Aqsa, about the Gaza war, about ISIS, about Syrian refugee crisis, but he's much more reluctant to speak about kind of domestic Jordanian political concerns, including what happened with Hamza, the pro-democracy efforts or lack thereof. So he's been very cautious since then. But I was able to speak with some of his former classmates, individuals who trained with him in the military. I spoke with his commander in the Jordanian military, various former Jordanian ministers, former US ambassadors to Amman, who I found to be actually the most helpful because they're the ones on the ground meeting with him 2 to 3 times a week, former CIA directors. One example just of an anecdote with the former US ambassador to Amman in the 9/11 attacks. King Abdullah was actually flying to the United States on September 11th for one of his many meetings with US officials. And he wanted to continue, after the terror attacks happened, he actually wanted to continue to fly and land in the United States. And the US ambassador at the time had to tell him, no, you can't land in the United States. We're having a flight ban right now, that the country is in a really crazy situation. We're not, we appreciate your support, but that's just not a priority right now. And King Abdullah said, no, 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 I want to continue. So actually what happened, according to the U.S. ambassador, Queen Rania called the U.S. ambassador, says, you've got to convince him that he can't come. It's just the U.S. is not in a position to take a foreign leader right now. So that what happened was after Queen Rania intervened, then they had another conversation between the U.S. ambassador and the king, and then he finally convinced him that, you can't actually fly to the United States on September 11th. You're going to have to wait, and you can come at a later point. So that just shows just the level of engagement these U.S. ambassadors have with the king himself is quite extraordinary.
Wow. I was also not aware of that. So I want to highly recommend your book. We barely scratched the surface of the level of depth that you go into as a result of many of these fantastic interviews and your own research and background. So very highly recommend the book and wish we had more time to go into more of it. But I just wanted to give you a minute at the end if there was any closing thing you didn't have a chance to say yet, or anything else you wanted to leave the audience with.
Well, I just want to thank Quincy again. Thank you, and all very much for the platform. I really appreciate the opportunity. And yeah, I just think Jordan in general doesn't get nearly enough media attention, especially in the United States, that it deserves. Few people know, but the Washington Post and New York Times, Wall Street Journal, none of them have full-time correspondents in Jordan. So there's just a gap in the literature. And I hope that this book will allow individuals who might not be as familiar with Jordanian politics or that interested in the foreign policy elements to have an opportunity to kind of a deep dive into Jordanian political situation.
Fantastic. Well, thank you again. Thanks to everyone for joining us, and look forward to maybe hosting you for your next book.
Thank you.